Hebrew, that's a transliteration of the Hebrew name, covenant name of God. So anytime you see Yahweh on one of these slides, it's talking about God. So Yahweh said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen?" If you remember what just happened, Abel has sacrificed the better offering from his flock. And we talked about last week how that had to have been something that God instructed him to do, because he did it by faith, and faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. But Cain offered from his plants, something God did not tell them to do. And therefore Cain's offering was rejected. Well, this makes Cain furious. And this is what God says to Cain: "Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen?" He's asking, why did you get angry? Do you have any right to be angry? Why are you sad? Why has your face become depressed? I think this is on. Maybe not. There we go. "If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it." So he says, if you do well, won't you be accepted? The obvious answer to that is yes. If you do well, if you do as I tell you, you'll be accepted. And if you do not do well, if you do not do what I tell you, sin lies at the door. I want you to notice a few things. Now, the concept of sin has already been presented. We read about that in Genesis chapter 3. But the word sin, this is the first appearance of the word sin in the Bible right here. Sin lies at the door. The way God is describing sin is like some kind of predator. Literally, the Hebrew means it is hiding right at the entranceway, ready to pounce at any moment. It wants to overtake you. You remember what Peter called the devil in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. He is a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Sin is something that God considers dangerous. God considers it powerful. And he is not misguided like we humans can be on just the consequences of sin. Sin is pictured as a predator ready to make the kill. Anyone have cats in here? Anyone have cats? I figured there'd be more dogs. You probably see it in dogs too, but more so in cats. How they sneak up on something, ready to pounce. That's what God is picturing this. But think of more like a tiger or something. Don't think of like a house cat. Think of more like a tiger. Something that's ready to pounce and destroy you. And its desire is for you. Its eyes are set on Cain. And really they're set on all of us. It sends eyes, its desires set on all of us. It wants to destroy us. But you should rule over it. God is telling Cain, you have the power through me to control this temptation. This is a discussion of temptation. Sin lies at the door. He's tempted to act on his anger, to act on his fury, to act on his envy. And sin is ready to overtake him in that. He says, but you should rule over it. You have the capability to choose not to sin. God is warning him of that right now. Verse 8, but we see what Cain does. Now Cain talked with Abel, his brother. And it came to pass, we don't know how long this was, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and killed him. If you were in the class on Sunday morning, we talked about self-defense. Self-control is a different lesson. Self-defense, the Christian in self-defense, and how one of the points we made is that how guns are not the problem with America. We discussed that a little bit. And one of the reasons we gave is because God never saw fit to mention the weapon Cain used. We've talked about how guns were not the issue because the weapon Cain used in the very first murder was never mentioned. God didn't care about it. He cared about the personal responsibility. Look at this. Cain rose up against Abel, took time to do this, rose up against him and killed him. What did he kill him with? I don't know. Maybe a stone, maybe a stick, maybe his bare hands, maybe a knife, whatever. He rose up against Abel and killed him. Now, oftentimes we think of this as the first murder, and it is. But I want you to notice something else. This is the first time in all of human history, at least recorded, that we see a human being physically die. Not only was Abel murdered, the very first time a human dies physically is by murder. I don't know if that's profound to you, but just think about it. The very first time someone dies, it's because of a sinful action. What God said about sin in Genesis chapter 3, how it will bring death, is truly coming to pass here. Verse 9, then Yahweh said to Cain, where is Abel, your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? Now Yahweh, God, he knew what happened to Abel. He's asking this, as he does a lot throughout the scriptures, trying to get them to confess what they did, trying to get them to be honest about what they did. Where is Abel, your brother? And instead, Cain pulls this. He tries to think he knows better than God. He's trying to pull one over on God. He says, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? In modern English, am I my brother's babysitter? Am I responsible for knowing where my brother is at all times? It's often thought that Cain and Abel were adults at this point. Maybe they were. They probably weren't kids. They were probably mature. They knew what they were doing. I don't know how long after they were born that this happened, but Cain knew what he was doing. And he's definitely not his brother's keeper. That wasn't the point God was making. If they were old enough to know what they were doing, they're old enough to live their own lives. Cain was not his brother's keeper. But that's not the point God was making. He asked, where is Abel, your brother? Where is he? He's trying to get him to confess something. Verse 10, and he said, what have you done? Okay, so Cain's not confessing. So God just straight out asks him, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. That is interesting language. I don't know how many people think of somebody's blood crying out to God to take vengeance, to have justice. Abel's blood is crying out from the ground, according to God, for justice. Every time murder happens in our society, in any society, the innocent blood is crying out to God for justice. Now, this is not going to be a lesson on abortion or the many murders that have happened because of abortion. But just think of that for a minute. The millions and millions and millions of babies that have been aborted since Roe versus Wade. Even before that, when it was illegal. Cries out to God. Blood of the innocent crying out to God. He says, your brother's blood cries to me. Literally, it shrieks out of horror to me. He wants Cain to feel guilty for what he's done. Cain should feel guilty. When we sin, we should feel guilty. Of course, we can be forgiven. Of course, we can have God's grace and we have God's mercy. Of course, all those things are wonderful. But every time we sin, we should feel bad about it. God wants us to. It's a contrite heart that God turns to. You don't have a contrite heart when you're proud of your sin. It cries out to God from the ground, the blood of Abel. So now you are cursed. This is God talking to Cain. Now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. Now he's talking like the ground is some kind of person. It's opened its mouth to receive this blood. He says, now Cain, you are cursed. What was Cain's profession? What was he? He was a farmer. This curse particularly hits home. Cain probably his entire life, all he knew was farming. In fact, he brought the best of his crops, I'm assuming, to God. Even though God did not require crops, he brought the best of his crops probably to God, wanting to be genuine, wanting to be sincere. He's probably a pretty good farmer. God has cursed the ground because of Cain. He cursed Cain and cursed the ground because of Cain. Now that you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood. So this is justice. This is justice. God could kill Cain. Cain deserves to die. But we'll see in a minute God's mercy working. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you. The fugitive and a wanderer you will be on the earth. Some translations for wanderer say vagabond. A stranger and a wanderer. He will roam the earth for the rest of his life. He won't be able to settle permanently in one spot, is the point. He'll be a stranger and a wanderer, and the ground is cursed because of him. It will not yield, bring about its strength like it used to for Cain. And Cain said to Yahweh, my punishment is greater than I can bear. It's a cry for mercy. It's a cry for mercy. And God, or Cain continues right here, but after this, God will be merciful to him. Cain says, surely you have driven me out this day from the face of the ground. I will be hidden from your face. I will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. And it will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me. So all this that he said before that right here is he's understanding what God has told him. He understands what God has not been confusing to him. He understands his punishment. But then he says it's too much for me. Because of this, whoever finds me will kill me. Stop right there. So many times when people read this passage, and it's understandable why, but they don't think beyond, they don't use common sense and think beyond this passage. It is understandable just from the straight reading up to this point. A lot of people think Cain and Abel were the only two children of Adam and Eve at this point. Because this says, and it will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me. When they read that, they're confused. They're like, okay, Abel's dead. Who's going to find Cain to kill him? I have a couple suggestions. One, it could be Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve still alive. From what I understand, parents get pretty mad when their children are murdered. Second, and the more likely one, there were already more children of Adam and Eve. Nowhere in the account before this does it say Adam and Eve only had Cain and Abel up to this point. Remember, by the time Cain killed Abel, even by the time Cain and Abel offered their sacrifices to God, it says that time has passed. We don't know how much time or how many children have been born to this point. But Cain is obviously scared of people. He's scared of what people will do to him because of what he did to Abel. Anyone who finds me will kill me. It's probably talking about his siblings. Then God says to this, Yahweh said to him, therefore whoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. Now that is mercy. That is mercy in action. Cain is deserving to die right there, right then. We are deserving to die when we sin right there, right then. But God has mercy. Not only does he spare Cain's life, he does curse him. He has consequences that go along with his sin. Don't get God wrong here. But not only does he spare him his life, he says, vengeance will be taken on the person who kills Cain sevenfold. Notice the number 7. That is not arbitrary. That's not just put there for any reason. 7 will be, you need to pay attention anytime you read the Bible, number 7. Now, don't get carried away with this. Now, there's sometimes it's just literally meaning 7. But usually, 7 is very symbolic. Most numbers in the Bible, when it's repeated over and over again, have symbolic qualities. Does anyone know the symbolic meaning of the number 7? What does 7 represent? Perfection, exactly. 7 represents perfection. Perfect number, 7. What God is saying is that the person who kills Cain will have vengeance completely for Cain. Cain will be avenged completely. Over and over again. Cain will be avenged. Whatever happens to Cain, if someone kills him, then the person who did that will die, is what he's saying. That person will die. And Yahweh set a mark on Cain. This is how he showed his promise to Cain. And how Cain could show the promise that God made to other people. The mark was placed on Cain so that anyone finding him should not kill him. I think it's interesting that, now God might have told them, but it doesn't say that for sure. I think it's interesting that other people would have known what the mark of Cain was supposed to mean. Cain might have told them if they saw it. God might have told them beforehand. Who knows? But it just implies that they would have known what that mark was supposed to mean. What is the mark of Cain? Well, I have the answer for you. No idea. No clue. Never met Cain. Don't know what it looks like. Some people, out of ignorance and out of years of just being taught this and growing up in a society like this, think it's black skin. Some people today even still think it's black skin. They think it's a racist thing. It has to do with race. The problem with that is because black skin can actually be traced to Ham, the son of Noah. We'll get to that when we get to Noah. To Ham, the son of Noah. We'll talk about that when we get to Noah. Okay, I promise. But people who do this are trying to put a curse on being colored a different way than they are. That's racism. That's textbook racism. Let me tell you this, if you're struggling with racism, I know there are plenty of Christians who struggle with racism. I have family who struggles with racism just because of the society they grew up in. I'm not a racist. Christians cannot be racists. Racism is sin. Racism will cause you to go to hell. Listen to me right now. Prejudice because of a physical trait somebody cannot change, whether it be race or anything else, will cause you to lose your soul. I'm not going to say it any more plainly than that. I can't. You'll go to hell for racism. That'll happen. You cannot be racist and be a Christian. The mark of Cain is not his color. Whatever it is, it's not that. So but people can know that if they killed him, they would be killed as well. So the mark was put there, and they understood what that mark meant. Verse 16, then Cain went out from the presence of Yahweh and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. Okay, so Cain leaves this point. He leaves, I think that's interesting, the presence of Yahweh. The word Yahweh is kind of a tricky word to translate. It means I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. But there's also a nuance to the word Yahweh that kind of means someone who is always present. Omnipresence is really what that word is. Someone who is always present. I think it's interesting. Anytime you see the words Lord in all capital letters, really the name of Yahweh, and that's what that means. Anytime you see that with the words, they left the presence of that individual, I think it's interesting language. How can you leave the presence of someone who is always present? You cannot literally do that. Cain didn't literally leave Yahweh. Okay? He left from that state of being in a relationship with Yahweh. He left where Yahweh was dwelling, where Adam and Eve and that family would have been worshiping Yahweh. But God, by the very definition of his name, still watched over and cared for Cain. He left the presence of the one who is always present. And dwelt in the land of Nod. Now stop. I thought it said he was going to be a wanderer and a stranger. What's this dwelling business? There's a little bit of confusion with the Hebrew. The word dwelt has a couple different meanings to it. He could have lived in Nod for a certain amount of time, then had to leave. It doesn't say he forever stayed in Nod. It said he dwelt in Nod. Or it could be he passed through a land that would be called Nod. Now, Nod? It's a good question. I was just about to get to that. Now, Nod is probably named by people who lived during the time of Moses. Here's the reason I say that, or even before that. Here's the reason I say that. We got to remember who's writing this book. Moses is writing this book. You got to remember who the audience is. The Israelites of Moses' generation are the original audience of this book. Many times, God, through Moses, uses some type of writing technique, literary technique, to talk about something they were familiar with while using a name they were familiar with. The land, they knew the land. If he used the word Nod, the original audience would have known what that land was like, where he dwelt. That does not mean that the land was called Nod when Cain got there. That makes sense? That does not mean that the land was called Nod when Cain got there. It does mean that the Israelites, the original audience, were familiar with the land that Cain went to. Well, hold on. There might have been it says the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And then he builds a city after that in this next verse. We'll talk about that here in a second. And Cain had sex with his wife. He knew his wife. And she conceived and bore Enoch. Stop again. There's a lot of stuff with Cain. Stop again. Some people have a problem with this. Where in the world did Cain get a wife? I'm asking, where did Cain get a wife? Just use some logic here. Where do you get a wife? What'd you say? That's what you always wondered? Like we mentioned earlier, Adam and Eve had other children. Chapter 5 will talk about how they have other children. It'll mention it briefly.
I always looked at that as what difference it could be two things. It could have been his sister, or God could have just made him a wife. It wasn't germane to the topic, so it's just left out. You know, it just said he had a wife. It came from God, and how God did it is basically none of our business because he didn't choose to tell us.
Well, yeah, okay. That's good insight. I guess it depends on how far they are at this point. Right. We don't know when Cain had conceived a child, or his wife conceived a child. We don't know when Cain became a father. We don't know that. All right? How far after? I don't think we know how far after creation it actually happened. Here's why I believe it was a relative. Here's why I believe that. The Bible talks about Adam and Eve having more sons and daughters. Adam lived to be 930, I believe, 930 years, something like that, and had lots of sons and daughters. Probably had some sons and daughters by this point. Cain might have been already married by the time he killed Abel. He might have already been married. We don't know. Here's why I don't think God made a special woman for Cain. Because the Bible talks about how Eve is the mother of all the living. If there has to be someone who's living, like a human coming, it has to be somebody who is a descendant of Eve. Or God is a liar. It's that strict. I mean, it's a little detail, but it's that strict. Because if God says Eve is the mother of all the living, then I'm inclined to believe Eve was the mother of all the living. That's what I'm inclined to believe. It doesn't tell us where the wife came from, but if Adam and Eve were the only first two, and everybody comes from Adam and Eve, it only stands that Cain's wife, whoever she was, came from Adam and Eve. That only makes sense to me. I don't know. I hope that makes sense to you. Okay. And they named the child Enoch. And he built a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. Okay, now it says Cain built a city. Now what about this wanderer thing, this stranger thing? It does not say he stayed in this city. It said he built one. It does not say he stayed there. It says he built one. He built a city for his son's name, his son's honor, named it Enoch. It does not say Cain stayed there. And to Enoch was born Irad. And Irad begot Mehujael. And Mehujael begot Methushael. And Methushael begot Lamech. I wish there was a whole lot more to say about these random names put up here. I don't know what they looked like, how they were, but I do know something. And this is kind of speculation, but it's not really. From what the Bible teaches us about parenting, I can figure something out. Lamech, as we're about to read, was not a good guy. Lamech was not a good guy, at least in the picture that the Bible presents him. Now, I know there are exceptions, but the vast majority of the time, if kids grow up with godly parenting, the kids will be godly. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is older, he will not depart from it. I know that's a proverb, and proverbs deal with probability, but think about that language. Train up a child in the way he should go. So many parents think, this happens a lot. I know a lot of broken homes. In my young years, I know in a lot of broken homes. I know y'all know a lot of broken homes too. So many Christian parents are training up children, and sometimes that child ends up not being godly. Sometimes, and it's actually very, very rare, that child is ungodly because the parents did the vast majority of things right. Now, parents aren't perfect, but it's very rare that that child ended up ungodly because the parents did things right. But what happens a lot of times, especially with Christian families, is the parents think they're doing things right. And they wonder, what happened? What happened to my child? Well, when you start researching and asking questions to these parents, you kind of start finding holes that are not really righteous holes within their parenting system, that aren't godly holes. Or they didn't think it was bad, but it definitely was not good. That happens a lot. A lot. And that gets thrown into the mix of the people who say, well, my child went ungodly because I raised them righteous and something just happened. That gets thrown into that mix. And that's not fair. What God still says is still true. Train up a child in the way he should go. Not in the way you think he should go, the way he should go. And when he's older, he will not depart from it. The vast majority, that is true. The reason I think Lamech ended up not so well is because Methuselah was not that great. The reason I think Methuselah was not that great was probably because Mehujael was not that great. And the reason I think Mehujael was not that great was probably because Irab was not that great. You know why I think Irab was not that great? Probably because Enoch was not that great. You know why I think Enoch probably wasn't that great? Cain was not that great. The New Testament does not have flattering words to say about Cain. Cain is talked about as wicked. Now, of course, he committed a wicked act, but everybody commits a wicked act at least once. Yet his name is forever stained as wicked. I'm thinking he did more to live a wicked life than just murder his brother. That's probably what it's looking like. All right, we got a couple minutes more. We'll go as far as we can. Then Lamech took for himself 2 wives. The name of one was Adah, and the name of the second was Zillah. Now, I don't know if I'm pronouncing these right. This is the way I pronounce them. So he had 2 wives. Now, the reason I have that bracketed is because the New Testament will teach over and over again that in God's eyes, when you're married, you're only married one time to one woman. Unless there are scriptural reasons you get married again. But even then, it's still just the one woman. You can't have 2 wives. Does not work. Now, I know you might be thinking, what about all the polygamous relationships? David had many wives and all that you find in all the concubines you find throughout the Old Testament. Find me one verse where God is approving of that. You can't do it. Find me one verse. God says that's okay. Just because somebody does it does not mean God's okay with it. Find me one verse. You can't do it. All right, so he has 2 wives. The name of one was Adah, and the name of the other was Zillah. I don't guess that's really important. But he had 2 wives. He has already taken for himself 2 people. Here's what's interesting. If you look at the Hebrew of this, something very interesting appears. It doesn't just say he had 2 wives. It said he took for himself 2 wives. That language kind of suggests these are slaves. These are people he has on collar and chain. He's collecting wives like trophies. Lamech is not a good dude. And Adah bore Jabal. who was the originator of those who dwell in the tents and have livestock. And the nomadic people who ran around with livestock had tents set up and moved place to place with this purpose. The originator, the father of these people. His brother's name was Jubal. You have Jabal and Jubal. He was the originator of all those who play the harp and flute, all these musicians. Music probably became a big cultural thing. It still is today during this time. He was the originator of this, of people who play the harp and the flute. And as for Zillah, she also bore Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Okay, so we have Tubal-Cain, who is an instructor, he's a teacher, of every craftsman in bronze and iron. Let me just tell you how deep-seated, this is probably the last thing we talk about, how deep-seated evolution has become in our society, in our culture. We think there was a difference between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. Raise your hand if you ever grew up learning that. You ever learned there was the Bronze Age, or it's the Stone Age and the Bronze Age and like the Iron Age and it's steel or whatever, and it's gone on from there. Raise your hand. I know there's more people who grew up learning that, okay. That's not true. It says in bronze and iron. People back then, we'll talk about this next week, people back then, vastly intelligent. I'll probably have pictures next week of artifacts and stuff that have been dug up and kind of dated back to around this time that they probably created. Vastly intelligent people. Evolution says we are the smartest out of their arrogance. Evolutionists say we are the smartest the human race has ever been. The Bible has a different picture. We're getting worse and worse. We are the dumbest human beings have ever been. Sorry, but that's the way it is. We're probably the dumbest human beings have ever been. Now, you can't measure intelligence with technology, the technology available at a time. You can't measure that. That's not how intelligence works. But just because we have technology does not make us brainiacs. In fact, I could line up a lot of people right now that have plenty of technology that are not brainiacs. Just because you have a computer does not mean you're smart. And it definitely does not mean you're wise. Technology does not equal intelligence. These people were very smart, vastly more intelligent probably than we are as we stand. Okay, so that's where we'll stop. Next week we'll pick up with verse 23. Thank you for your attention.